today's meeting with South Suburban mayors and managers,
Uh-huh.
Holland did such a wonderful presentation, and I know the gentleman. So they are thinking about to have uh, rental density restrictions in entire
Ugh,
suburbs. So,
wow.
according to them, it will increase the percentage of owner occupied substantially, where all the renters are going to go. What will happen to the landlords? And we are not invited on that table.
See, they're jumping on the bandwagon. There's that federal law that's been proposed, which takes aim at corporate housing, into corporations, businesses that have like hundreds or thousands of rentals. And right now they're exempting. They don't want those to own rentals anymore. They're right now they're exempting sort of the mom and pop, but it seems to be like everybody's jumping on this anti-rental bandwagon recently, and it's going to be I don't know what that's going to spell for us.
Well, is everything is in a cycle. So
Yeah.
United States went through the same thing back in 50s, the same conversation. So what happened was federal government built 10,000 units in one
Hmm.
cluster called Cabrini Green.
Hmm.
So they find out back in 80s that this thing is not going to work out. You cannot concentrate people like this. You cannot make second class citizens. You cannot segregate people based on their economics. Okay, so they demolish everything. They started giving away the Section 8 program. Now, all those people that they made those decisions to demolish it, they're all gone and dead. The ones
Hmm.
that actually built the Cabrini Green, they're all gone and dead. The new people in charge, they have no idea the country went through this already. So basically,
Hmm.
what happened is people can have to be housed someplace. So if you don't want it to be in your town and it doesn't want to be in the next town, they have to go somewhere and build another 25,000 unit and repeat the same process again.
Yep, but they're just making all of these, they're making it so much difficult for us passing all these rules, regulations, and laws that are going to be incredibly difficult for us to comply with. Now, there are other areas of the country that already have some of these laws in effect, and they're not doing well, but I don't know. It's just getting more and more difficult to be a landlord in Illinois. I know we keep saying that, but boy, I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, anyway, we're going to continue making money in real estate as landlords. Believe it or
Mhm.
not, if you stick with it, you're a millionaire. But other than that,
Other than that, it's going to be incredibly difficult. Yeah.
it's a bumpy
Anyway,
road. Okay, so we got to get this started. We're
yep.
talking about we can't hide behind our. Okay, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hadi Fala, and I am the managing broker of Fairview Realty Group. We have every Thursday these meetings, and it helps. We're hoping that it helps you guys with your rental practice or your rental business. Mary's going to take over and she's talking about the new law that we need to comply with. Go ahead, Mary.
Great. Thank you so much, Hadi. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We always begin our meetings today with a little bit of a disclaimer saying, we are, Hadi especially is our experts in property management and rental properties, but all the information that we're presenting to you today is informational purposes only. And it's up to everybody to check with their attorneys, with their CPAs, with their contractors, whoever it is that you work with to make sure that it fits your situation and, we're not sort of steering you off course. Now today is going to be we're talking about a law, and I'm going to show you, how to do it. But again, it's always not a bad idea to check with your team to make sure that you're in compliance correctly. Okay, so today we're going to talk about something called the Corporate Transparency Act. There are sometimes we do our presentations during the week that are really interesting and really engaging and interesting topics. And today's not going to be, one of those because it's an act, it's a law, we have to comply with it. It's brand new, we don't know anything about it, we're worried about it, but it is an incredibly important law. It's a federal law. There are very severe stiff penalties, and all businesses have to comply with it. So I'm glad you guys took some time out of your day, of your week, to attend today's presentation because it's really, really important. So today's called the Corporate Transparency Act, what we're going to cover. And we're going to divide it into three different steps here, or three different portions of the presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to just some important terms that are associated with the business world and some concepts just so that you understand when I refer to them in the Corporate Transparency Act. Then I'm going to spend a couple minutes just giving you a little bit of introduction to what the act is, who has to comply with it, what are the due dates, how much does it cost, sort of the who, what, when, where, and why of the act. And then the third part of today's presentation, I'm going to give you step-by-step instructions to fill out this report, and I'll talk about it here in a little bit. There's a report that is required for all businesses to submit, and I have screenshots, wrote out every single one of the steps, and I'll give everybody a PDF of these instructions. That way you can file for yourself or fill it out for yourself. Okay. So I mentioned the first part, just going to give you a quick overview of like businesses and in their terms and concepts so that you understand what the Corporate Transparency Act is referring to when they use these terms. I'm just going to zip through this very quickly. This is not going to be an introduction to, businesses 101 or what the terms are. Sometimes when usually when we in the landlord workshops introduce a topic, we talk about it, we discuss it, I expound upon it a little bit. We're not going to do that today. I'm just going to introduce the term, give you a definition, discuss it as it pertains to the act, and move on. Otherwise, we're going to be here for like 3 hours, and we don't want to do that. But if I mention something and you don't understand it, please go ahead and, let me know either in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask that question. Other than that, I'm just going to zip through the first section here. Okay. So the most important term that the Corporate Transparency Act is going to talk about is an entity. It's the same term is either called an entity or a corporate entity or a business as an entity. And what this is just an organization that one or more people form to conduct their business. And you have a business and you want to, make money from that business. Why do people use entities? A couple of different reasons. One of them is they want to protect their assets. And when I give examples, I'll always, of course, phrase them in terms of, landlords, but, you own rental properties, your tenant slips and falls, and they're going to sue you. Well, you form an entity to protect your rental properties against the tenant winning and seizing your properties, getting, money from you. Another reason that people use entities is to shield their identity for privacy. You don't want your tenants knowing, how many rental properties you own, what they're worth, that you are the one that owns them. And then this is a really big one. And entities have really fabulous tax advantages. Any person, I don't want to say rich person, but I guess any wealthy person invest in real estate because they have tremendous tax advantages. One of the reasons why rich people get rich is because they use real estate for their tax advantages. So because of this, entities have lots of financial and legal consequences. So this is where talk to your attorney, especially, and your CPA if you're thinking about forming an entity if you don't already have one. There's 4 types of entities, and I'm just going to, again, briefly go over these because some of you have an entity or are thinking about setting one up, but you don't know which one is good for you. If I have one of these 4 types of entities, do I have to file, this report according to the Corporate Transparency Act? So let's just really quickly review these 4 types of of entities. One of them is called a sole proprietorship. And this one is basically just somebody and they own a business and they own it by themselves. This is a lot of mom and pop landlords are sole proprietors. In the sole proprietorship, the money that you make personally, maybe you have a W-2 job or whatever other income you have is mixed in with the business money. It's just reported on the same income tax return. You don't really separate it out. Entities, you can register with the state to be recognized as an entity, but you don't have to. A lot of people have a sole proprietorship and they don't register with the state. And as I mentioned, a lot of small mom and pop, individual landlords have sole proprietorships. Another type of entity is a corporation. There are S corps and C corps. I think a lot of you have heard these terms before. And these are independent business entities. In other words, the business is completely separate than the owner. So it's different than a sole proprietorship where the individual owner and the business are sort of mixed in together, not with the corporations. They're completely separate. And what the owners do is they get a share of the business in return for investing time, money, whatever it is that they invest. Corporations do have to register with the state to be recognized. And I'll explain to you in a minute what it means to register with the state. And as corporations, a lot of businesses will register as a corporation because it shields the owners, from their asset protection, lots of tax advantages, and a lot of landlords do use S corps. Partnership, not so much used by landlords. This is something that's a business that's owned and operated by a bunch of people, not just one person, but multiple people. Every one of those individuals gets some of the profit, but they also have a share in the liabilities. So in other words, if somebody sues them, the money or the profit that they make is distributed right to the individuals who are sharing in this partnership. That's different than corporations. Sometimes corporations, you get shares, you get rewarded in other ways. The partnership is similar to the sole proprietorship because your income on your income tax, you mix in your personal money with your partnership money, and you don't have to register with the state. And then the last one is a limited liability corporation. I think a lot of us have heard about this. These are the LLCs. And a lot of people like these because it gives you a little bit of the benefits of the corporation and some of the benefits of the partnership because it keeps the landlords from being sued, and there's lots of really good tax advantages. So I would say the LLC is something that the landlords really, really often use. I always strongly urge everybody to have a business entity to protect their rental properties and to, make really good use of the tax advantages. But this gives you a quick overview of the 4 different types. Which one is good for you? Just talk to an attorney or somebody who can help you to set up that entity. But most landlords have either a sole proprietorship, some of them register with the state, some of them don't, or an LLC that owns the actual properties. Some landlords do have an S corp, but they tend to be landlords who are more like real estate investors. In other words, they're buying and selling, buying and selling. They have a large amount of transactions that they do, or they have businesses where the income is active income. I think all of you guys know, but rental properties are passive income, but there are businesses who have active incomes. So maybe like you have an Airbnb that's associated with the real estate. So again, just think about which one of these you have. If you're thinking about setting one up, this gives you a little bit of an overview and you can talk to an attorney, but some of these are going to be subject to the Corporate Transparency Act. Some of these are not, and we'll go over which ones are and which ones are not. Entity documents. So in order for an entity to register with the state, they need several documents in order to register. So this is when, okay, I'm going to set up an entity. What does that mean when you set up an entity? Well, once you set up an entity, you have these types of documents: articles of incorporation, bylaws, an operating agreement, and a certificate of incorporation. A lot of people will, let me hold off what I'm going to say there. A lot of people, when they create an entity, they're going to try to figure out, okay, am I going to do it myself? How am I going to set this thing up? So you have to know how to fill out all of the forms and documents, and you need to know how to create all of these different documents. You just can't say, okay, I filed with the state, I'm done. There's a whole bunch of documents and things that you need to set up, a lot of forms that you need to fill out. So really give a lot of thought as to whether you want to try to set up the entity yourself. You can do it, but do you know what an article of incorporation is? Do you know what the annual requirements are? There are online companies like LegalZoom. I don't want to get in trouble or anything there, but I would highly recommend you don't use these legal online types, services there, because they're just going to they're either not going to give you some of these required documents, or they're not going to be specific to your state. They are definitely not going to be specific to your unique situation. And most times they are just going to fall apart in court if you're ever challenged on them. And by the time they cost a lot of money. Again, I don't want to push anybody in any particular way, but I highly, highly, highly recommend just talk to an attorney about setting up your entity. Because remember, the whole point of your entity is to protect you. If you ever get sued, if anything ever gets in trouble, you go to court and you're trying to save a dime by doing one of these methods, and then you get to court and it's completely going to blow up in your face because you didn't do it correctly. So it defeats the point of having these entities. Let me see. Dala, can you run an LLC as a sole proprietorship? I'm going to be honest. I'm not, an expert on this, Hadi. I don't know if you know the answer. They're completely two completely separate entities, but an LLC can have one or multiple partners.
Okay, so it's called single member LLC.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, just the wording is wrong. So
Yep.
sole proprietorship is just completely something. I'm not very familiar with them. I never had one. My CPA had one because that's where it is. But it's called single member entities.
LLC. Right, right, right. You're right.
And you have only one, there's one shareholder. My S corporation, one of them that runs Fairview, is a single member, but it's still a S corporation. Okay.
Great. Thank you for reminding me. And Dala, this is where I'm mentioning it's probably a good idea to talk to your attorney. And I know I keep saying it, but I promise here very shortly, we're going to have some attorneys come on and give us a whole presentation about entities. And I'll show you at the very end, the last slide or two, who we're going to have come on and explain these to us, because they're very complicated, but they are incredibly essential tools as us being a landlord. But Dala, just to answer your question, thank you, Hadi, for helping me. A sole proprietorship is one type of entity. An LLC is a different type of entity. Sole proprietorship is just one person. An LLC can be a single member LLC, as Hadi just said, or you can have multiple people on there. All righty, great question. The other interesting thing, or not interesting, but the other requirement for having a true business entity is not just having all these documents here, is entities must register with the state. I always thought it was kind of strange, but you have to register with the Illinois Secretary of State. Here's the website. Let me know if you want me to cut and paste it there in the chat. But anytime you do your driver's license, you go to the same, Secretary of State. And this is where you're going to have to submit some of these entity documents that I was talking about right here. You're going to have to submit some of them to the state. You got to pay $150, blah, blah, blah. There's some requirements with it. And the reason I mentioned this is, again, we're discussing these ideas in relation to the Corporate Transparency Act, in that a lot of you guys out there, or a lot of landlords, have businesses. I run Main Street real estate investing business, or I run Main Street properties. In your mind, that's a business, but it's not a true business with the state unless you have actually registered there with the state, and unless you have some of these actual documents. You can have a business called Main Street, landlording, but if you have a business where you don't actually register with the state and you don't have some of these other requirements, you're not going to need to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act. Only if you have a true business with these, and there are some other documents, but these are the main ones. You register with the state, and once, as part of registering with the state, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, is going to give you what's called an employer identification number, the EIN number. This is a unique number that's assigned to every business by the IRS, so they can tell which business it is. So it's sort of like a Social Security number for your business. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Where is it? I'm toggling between so many. So this is mine. And of course, during today's presentation, I'm using my information as an example. And just to keep some of my information private, I have to, blur out or X out some of that information. But this is the letter you will receive from the IRS once they assign you the EIN number. And here it is, right here. So unless you've received this letter from the IRS with your EIN number, you're not considered like a real business that has to comply with the the Corporate Transparency Act. And then the other requirement after you initially register with the state is you have to complete an annual report every year to remain in what the state calls good standing. If the business doesn't file this annual report, the state is gonna consider it inactive, and they're gonna move to dissolve it. So we'll get back to this point of which entities are active and which ones are not in good standing and need to be dissolved. Again, when we talk about the Corporate Transparency Act, because there are different requirements for the two. Okay, so hopefully everybody understands what a business is. If you guys print out some business cards and it says Main Street, properties, and that's all you do, and you're doing business under that name, you're business only in your mind, I guess. You're not really a true business that has registered with the state, has the required documents, and has to comply with the Corporate Transparency. And then the last term that we're going to talk about is called beneficial owner. Again, because this is where goes to the heart of what the Corporate Transparency Act is all about. And a beneficial owner is somebody who either directly, they take a part in, or they're just a passive person there, but they're still associated with it, who has substantial control over a company, or they own and control at least 25% of the company. So you need to consider this for any business that you own. Am I a beneficial owner? Do I exercise substantial control, or do I own or control at least 25% of the company? If I do, then I need to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act. If I'm not a beneficial owner, then I don't need to worry about this act. when you're trying to think about who a beneficial owner is, in your mind, you're saying, hey, am I a beneficial owner? A beneficial owner is somebody who does play a role in the decision making, or maybe they take part in the day-to-day operations. And that, is something that immediately comes to mind as somebody who's an owner, but this can also be a silent partner. We don't have time to get into it, but there are a lot of adults will make their children beneficial owners in companies because there's a lot of tax advantages to it. So children can be beneficial owners. Your grandmother, your cousin, any living human being can be a beneficial owner. They can take an active part in making decisions or running the company, or they can just be silent partners. Maybe some of you guys are silent partners in some companies, but you're still a beneficial owner. And then the last thing to remember here is the beneficial owner has to be a person according to the law, according to the Corporate Transparency Act. It's not a company. We know that especially a lot of companies have just hundreds of these companies. There's like shell companies, holding companies, trust, all of this. That's not considered a beneficial owner, these types of companies. It is an individual. It has to be Mr. or Mrs. Smith or whatever who are considered the beneficial owners. Diane says, if I am married and my husband owns the building and I do all the renting, am I a beneficial owner? Yes, I would say you are, because you have substantial control over what goes on in your rental business. Now, if you were just somebody who occasionally jumped in and didn't really have anything to do with it, day-to-day operations, then you probably wouldn't be a substantial, or if your names are not on any of the deeds for the properties, you're just sort of there. You're married to somebody who actually runs, owns, and operates the rental business, then you wouldn't have to do it. But if your husband owns a building and you do all the renting, you are a beneficial owner. And I think there's the people who put together this whole Corporate Transparency Act knew that there was going to be some questions like Diane just asked. Well, what do they mean by substantial control? So they issued some guidelines as to whether you are a beneficial owner because you have substantial control. So again, we're just going to go over these, but I need to go over these because you need to make a decision like Diane just asked. Hey, am I a beneficial owner or not? And the reason you need to answer that is because it's going to define whether you're going to need to comply with the act or not. So Diane, hopefully this will help you. A beneficial owner who has substantial control is somebody who has any of these criteria. So somebody's a senior officer. I think we have a good idea who senior officers are. The individual has authority to appoint or remove certain officers or directors of the company. Diane, I would say this is you. The individual is an important decision maker. So if you're renting out the properties, you're deciding who's renting your properties or not, or the individual has any other form of substantial control to that company. Hopefully this helps everybody. I think this is going to be the one that really, applies to a lot of people. But if you have an LLC, like I do, I'm a managing partner, so I would be considered, a senior officer. A lot of you guys who set up rental property companies, even though they're just 1, 2, 3, 4 people, you're still appointed as the president. So a lot of these criteria, if you meet any of these criteria, you are considered to be a beneficial owner. In the chat, Diane has a follow-up question. So do I have to do anything regarding the Transparency Act? Yes, you do. So because you rent out the properties, you're considered a beneficial owner. So you're going to have to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act, you and your husband. Okay. And I think a lot of people who fall into any of these criteria, you're going to have to follow this Corporate Transparency Act. Okay, so that was a quick overview of businesses and the terms and concepts you need to know in order to comply with this Corporate Transparency Act. Again, if you have any questions at all, please let me know.
Yeah, Mary,
Yep.
two things. Number one, for beneficial ownership, there's 3 papers. So think about it this way. Once a year, if you have an LLC or a corporation or anything registered with the state, you have to file and pay a fee. How much is it these days? $150?
I just paid right here. Yeah. This is it. So entities have to complete what's called the annual report. Yep.
Right, annual report. So if you are on the annual report, you have a beneficial interest.
Mm-hmm.
That's number 2. Wherever you have your checking account and your signatory on that checking account, and you have some sort of familiar what is called familiar relationship with the owner of the account, then you have a beneficial
Hmm.
interest because you have unrestricted access to all that money. An
Very
employee
good point. Yep.
doesn't. An employee doesn't. So over like one of my accounts, like at the Fairview, I have one of our people, that one of our VPs. She signs checks and she can withdraw. That's not a beneficial interest, but my wife, that she have access to that account, she have a she have a beneficial interest because she have access to that money. The third one is if they go around and sign contracts on behalf of the corporation. First of all, if they're not registered as a corporate officer with the state, that paper, it can be disputed and then it might get tossed out. And then they have a beneficial interest.
Excellent. Very, very good summary and expanding to other areas like Heidi was saying, checking accounts, bank accounts. If you guys sign rental contracts, if you have anything to do with the company, then yes, you're going to be a beneficial owner. But don't forget, you can also be a silent partner. Like I mentioned, a lot of landlords, a lot of business owners will have their kids as silent partners if they own or control at least 25% of the country of the company.
Right. The
Um,
kids are beneficial interest. So I haven't done mine because I have to like 4 or 5. I'm waiting for you to do first one before I do mine.
Yep, you might actually be exempt. So this is where I wanted to, when we get to the exemption section about exemptions, I don't know, maybe Fairview is exempt, maybe some of your companies are exempt. So I'll review that
Some of the
with
LLC,
everybody.
but the thing of it is, the federal government already have your information.
Oh,
Because
we're going to get to that one too. Yep,
okay, go ahead for it. I'm jumping ahead of you. Okay,
that's
next one.
okay. And then Rolanda had a question in the chat. She recommends you should also get a business license with the city in which your business is located. Yes, that's a really good point, Rolanda. Although it's a little bit different, if you're making and selling donuts, absolutely you need a business license. If you run a rental company, rental business in the city or the town or whatever, check with your city because some of them do require you to get a business license. Some of them do not. I think most of them do, but always check with your city. And then the last comment for that is if you do get a business license with the city, that does not automatically make you like a beneficial, or excuse me, that doesn't automatically mean you have to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act. The Corporate Transparency Act is who are the beneficial owners. They have an interest there in the companies. All righty. Let's move on there. Then now that you have a little bit of an overview of some of the terms, we're going to look. So what is this Corporate Transparency Act all about? I can tell you this is just causing a lot of furor, a lot of angst. A lot of people are scared and nervous and upset about this whole Corporate Transparency Act around the country. I wasn't quite sure what it was and how, what was going to be involved with it. I can tell you, don't worry about it. It's super quick and easy. So I thought I would start off by just giving you, now these are my terms, just a quick summary, one sentence. What is this Corporate Transparency Act? So it's a new law and it requires business entities. So remember, LLCs, sole proprietorships, S Corps, to disclose to the federal government who its beneficial owners are. And the way they do this is you have to give identifying information about you and the company, about the owners, by submitting what's called a beneficial information ownership report. So in other words, all we're going to have to do to comply with this Corporate Transparency Act is you're going to have to tell the government a little bit about information about yourself, your name, your address, your date of birth type of thing, a little bit of information about your business, the name, the address. If you file your business taxes with your name, your personal one, social security number, and remember, I mentioned that EIN number. If you have an EIN number, you have to submit that. And then you have to submit an ID. That's it. That's all the Corporate Transparency Act is about. It's basically telling the federal government who are the real owners behind these companies and then prove it to me by submitting an ID. That's all the Corporate Transparency Act is about. So hopefully with that understanding, now let's take a little bit of a closer look into the ins and outs and what this act is all about. Who does it apply to? So it applies to all companies in the entire United States, including business entities. So this is why I spent a little time telling you, what a business entity is. If you have an LLC, you have an S corp as a landlord, then you have to comply with this. And you're a company that does business in the United States, doing business. So that means that there are, domestic companies. Remember, I mentioned these here, but then it also is going to be foreign companies who do business in the US. This, I think, is going to be really eye-opening for a lot of foreign companies because they're going to have to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act as well, but as long as they're doing business in the US. But there's a little bit of a caveat here because if you have a business, remember I mentioned if you never registered with the state and you don't have that EIN number, it doesn't apply to you. So I think somebody was asking about the sole proprietorship. If you have a sole proprietorship, it's just you. You got a business card saying Main Street, properties. You never registered with the state. You don't have an EIN number. That's not you. So I think a lot of landlords are just not going to have to comply with this. But again, if you are a true business with all of those documents, EIN number, that does apply to you. Now, if you ever think about setting up a true business with all of this stuff, you are going to have to comply with this act. So I think it's important for everybody, even if you don't currently have I'll call it like a real business, because you don't have an entity, you're thinking about setting up an LLC or another entity. I think it's important for you to pay attention because you are going to have to comply with this. So you are going to have to submit this report. Let me go back for a second. When I say report, it's this beneficial information ownership report, the BOIR. So that's when I say the report or BOIR, that's what I'm referring to. So you are going to have to submit the report if you have an entity and you're actually buying and selling properties, you're renting properties out of it, if you're filing tax returns using your entity. So if you have an entity and you're registered, you have to file. The only ones that don't are these guys. Hopefully that clarifies who has to apply and who doesn't. Hadi, okay, I think this might help you since you said you haven't done the Corporate Transparency Act yet, because there are some important exemptions. There are a list of 23 companies that are exempt from the Corporate Transparency Act. We're not going to go over other than 2 of them because most of them have nothing to do with us landlords. They exempt, for example, banks and insurance companies and other types of businesses like that. But there are 2 exemptions that you guys could fall into, and because you're a landlord. Hadi, this one's for you. And I don't know, maybe some of you guys who are listening here today also meet these requirements, or excuse me, these exemptions. One of them is called the large operating company exemption, and you have to meet all of these criteria. So you have to have more than 20 full-time employees. These 20 full-time employees have to be employed in the United States. You have to have a physical location in the US. 5 million in annual gross revenue. So this means operational revenue. This does include rents, but for us landlords, this doesn't mean the equity in our rental properties. Only, rent does count. So if you're some of these large corporate landlords, absolutely you're going to have more than $5 million in annual gross revenue. I wish I had $5 million. I don't know if any of you do on the call, but if you do and you meet these requirements, you're exempt. And then that 5 million in revenue, you do report it on these. I didn't list them because it's too much information, but they specify these certain forms you have to file on. And that includes revenue here outside. If you eliminate the revenue that you earn overseas, that 5 million of revenue has to be outside of the US. So Hadi, I don't know, that helps you I know you run multiple businesses with all of these entities. That will give you guidance as to whether you are exempt according to this one exemption. And then the other exemption that I think a lot of us here on the phone or on today's meeting might fall into is something called the inactive entity exemption. And again, you have to meet all these criteria. So if your entity was established before January 1st of 2020, and you're basically not doing anything with that entity, it's just there, registered with the state, you haven't bought and sold anything, you're not collecting any rent, you're not paying contractors out of it, it's not owned by anybody who is not a US citizen or resident, there hasn't been any change in ownership in the past year, you haven't sent or received more than $1,000, in any bank account or financial institution associated with that entity, and you don't own anything. In other words, your rental properties are not titled in that entity. A lot of people, there have to be millions of inactive entities across the United States because people will, or companies, I should say, will set up an entity. Oh, I think I might need it for this, and then they never use it. Or they'll set up an entity for a specific person and for a specific reason, and they just never use it again. The Corporate Transparency Act wants us to get rid of all these inactive entities here. So take that into consideration when you're needing to comply with this act. You don't need to comply if you have an inactive entity. But I have a couple more slides later on because the attorneys who gave presentation about this do recommend some actions if you have inactive entities. Hadi, any questions about this one and the exemption for you or anything?
Well, this is pretty good. The only thing is, if you have an entity that is registered with IRS, by means is you have an EIN number.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't file your LLC taxes, you get a letter and a penalty.
Yep.
How you, if you have what is inactive LLC?
So that's something that the state requires, basically failing to file your annual report and paying your annual filing fee. So this is where I mentioned that the attorneys who I
Oh,
listened to
okay, yeah.
presentations about this say if you've got an inactive LLC, an inactive thing with the state because you didn't file your report, you didn't file your fee, it's better for you just to dissolve it. But we'll get to that here in a little bit.
Yeah, but how you get over the IRS issue? Because IRS.
I got a slide about that one.
Oh, okay, okay.
All right. So just think about it, guys. If you guys have an inactive entity, I do. I've got one I set up years ago. I just never do anything with it. I still file a report. I still file my fees because I think, maybe someday I'll use it, but it's considered an inactive entity. What are the due dates for complying with this Corporate Transparency Act? So this act was actually passed years ago in 2021. And then before you guys start groaning, saying, these darn Democrats doing all this stuff again, it's not. It was a bipartisan. So both the Democrats and Republicans wholeheartedly supported this act. And I'll explain why, the whole reason behind this act here. But it took them from 2021 and it didn't go in effect until this year, January 1st, because it took years to hammer out all the rules and requirements. And like I said, people, or businesses, I should say, were freaked out about this act. What does it mean? What do I got to do? But now it's finally in effect. So the due dates are, if you already have an entity and you sort of created it before this year, before January 1st of 2024, you have until next year. You have until January 1st of 2025 to file that BOIR report. But if you create a new entity starting, after January 1st of 2024, so now you still also have to fill out that BOIR report 90 days after you form a new entity. So this is a brand new step for this year when you create entities. And then after 2025, if you create a new entity, then you only have 30 days to submit that BOIR report. So they're giving us a grace period this year, 90 days to submit this. But we do have a whole year to submit this. But I was one of those people who was a little bit nervous. What does this mean? What do I got to do? So I figured I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. And that's why I'm letting you guys know about it now. You can choose when and how you want to do it. You do have a lot of time. The good thing about this BOIR report is that you only need to file it once. Unlike the state requirements, Hadi, I think this is important for you. There's no annual requirements. You file it once and you're done. The only reason you need to go back and revisit it is if there need to be any updates to the report. And if there are any updates, then you need to change it within 30 days. So for example, let's say Hadi sells Fairview and Virginia takes it over. Okay, so then you need to file that BOIR report. Or maybe Fairview changes their address or whatever it is, or Fairview changes their name to something else. If there are any changes like that to the actual company information, then you do need to update it within 30 days. Otherwise, file once and done. What does it cost? Nothing, thank God. Everybody was worried that they were going to have us, pay for all of these costly filing and changes reports. Thank goodness it doesn't cost anything to file the report. And then who can file the report? Anybody can. I did it, and I'll show you guys what I'm going to show you here. The next section is how you guys can do it yourself. So that's really nice. If people were worried that we were going to have to hire an attorney or CPA or somebody to untangle all these requirements. Nope, super, super quick and easy. You don't need to hire anybody if you don't want to file the BOIR report. But the very last slide, I'll show you contact information for attorneys who have already advertised that they will file a report for you if you just don't want to for whatever reason. And then the last little bit of information is just to give you a little bit of background as to why this Corporate Transparency Act was enacted, who's running it, what does it mean? The Corporate Transparency Act is part of the the government agency that sort of created it and is going to manage it is called a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. You're going to hear this agency many, many times when you hear about the Corporate Transparency Act, FinCEN. This is one of the bureaus within the U.S. Department of Treasury. So think about it. It's in the same department as the IRS. This is a federal agency. This is really big, big news, I guess, or it's a big deal. It's not like you're dealing with your local building, department from your local village. Yes, it's your building department has some power over you, but it's not like you're at the federal level. Think about all the bad stuff that the IRS can do to you. FinCEN is going to has the same power and authority over you if you don't comply with this Corporate Transparency Act. And the whole point, the whole reason that FinCEN exists is it collects and analyzes information about financial transactions, and they have a really good mission statement. They want to combat domestic and international money laundering, terrorist financing, and other financial crimes. So they are a criminal division of the government there, and they have the same sort of criminal, mission and goals as your DA, the ATF, the FBI. And the reason I mention all this, just again, I want to reiterate, this is big deal. You do not want to blow off this Corporate Transparency Act. You want to make sure that you comply because the big guns are going to go after you. The federal criminal division of the federal government is going to go after you if you don't. And the whole reason that this Corporate Transparency Act was enacted is they want to stop criminals who use these business entities to hide or launder money. And they specifically named they're going to use this act to go after drug dealers, scam artists, or people who commit fraud, money launderers, human traffickers, and terrorists. They specifically named these, but they're going to go after anybody, any company that basically is hiding money or laundering money. And I couldn't find like a numerical amount or a dollar amount that said how much this is costing people, money, but I did find one for just the scam artists, all those fake emails that we all get and all those telemarketing calls. Just in the scam artists and fraud division, it's cost people $10 billion in 2023. That's the smallest one, probably. How much money is involved with drug dealers, money launderers, terrorists, all of that? I mean, you're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars. So this is why the Corporate Transparency Act was created, to fight all of these billions of dollars and all these bad people. And the reason that they do that is right now, the federal agencies or whatever, criminal enforcement agencies, they can't find these criminals. They can't find them. If they can't find them, they can't arrest them. If they can't arrest them, then they can't prosecute these criminals. Why? I mean, you wouldn't think that these drug dealers and all these people are, but they absolutely are creating entities to hide their identities. There are thousands and thousands of these entities that are created by these criminals basically to hide their criminal activity. So they will create one of the entities, run their scam, sell their drugs, whatever it is that they're doing, and then that's it. They'll dissolve the entity, and before the criminal justice system catches up with them, that's it. They're gone, they're done, they're not doing business under this entity anymore, and they've gone on to a new entity, and there's no way for the federal government to find out who the beneficial owners of these entities are because they are criminals. So it's harming people. It's harming us as U.S. citizens. I mean, terrorists, human traffickers. So there's a personal cost to all of these crimes. But then the government is losing a lot of tax revenue, millions and millions of dollars in revenue because they're not able to tax a lot of these transactions. So I wanted to definitely mention that because a lot of people I mentioned, or a lot of people think, oh, here we go, another law, another requirement. I got to comply with this, with the federal government. Yeah, you do, but this is a really, really good reason. Hopefully it'll start cutting back, at least for a lot of us hopefully you've never been subjected to this, but there are just so many people who have been, the victims of scam artists and fraud. Hopefully this will help to cut down on this. I think I'm going to just go through one or two of these because I want to get to the last part of the presentation here showing you how to comply with it. But basically what they're going to start to do is this year, they're going to start collecting the identifying information about the entities. And then next year is when they're going to start monitoring and checking it. And the way that the BOIR is going to work, or excuse me, the Corporate Transparency Act is going to work is they're going to collect the information via this report I'm going to tell you about, and they're going to start cross-checking it against some of these financial information. So for example, did you guys submit your BOIR? They're going to start checking the financial information on tax returns. They're going to start cross-checking the BOIR report against the entity information that you file with the state. So it's not like you're just going to fill out that report and then it's going to sit there. Nope. FinCEN next year is really going to start cross-checking that information you submit in your report against financial transactions, tax returns, bank accounts, anything that has to do with finances, they're going to check across that information. And then they're also going to work with state and local enforcement agencies to start going after some of these criminals. Again, it's going to be a really good act. Yeah, we got to comply with it, but hopefully we'll get some good, traction off of it. And then lastly, anytime the government does something big, you get these conspiracy theorists throwing myths out there about what it is and how it's going to harm you and why you shouldn't comply. And so there's a couple of these myths floating around. And Hadi, this is where you were talking about earlier. A lot of people are saying, oh, because the businesses have to disclose, who owns the property. People are scared. Well, what is the government going to do with that business? They're going to find out who you are, what your business is. They're going to use this information against you. Another example of Big Brother, spying on us. And then the other big fear is that this entity ownership information is going to be made public. In other words, you and I can log on to the FinCEN website and find out who owns all these entities. That's not the case. Hadi, you were going to mention about how this information is already available anyway, so if you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, it's okay. So this is very strange. This is the first year. I'm in real estate, so I buy real estate, sell real estate, trade real estate. This is the first year that on the cash transactions, I received 1099s from the title company.
Mm-hmm.
So I received like 6 or 8, not a big deal. It's just we were going to report the income and the transactions anyway. But title companies, they start, I don't know if it's tied to this thing or not, but the title companies, they start 1099 and everybody. If they don't have correct information, entity information for you, they won't close you. We used to go to the title company and we would tell the seller, who do I make the deed to? We said, oh, make a XYZ LLC. Okay, XYZ LLC. They send you the deed. They will record the deed, and that was the end of it. Now the title company have these forms you need to complete to tell them what the name of the LLC is, who's the beneficial owners of it, what's the tax ID number of it, and all of that.
That is absolutely tied to this Corporate Transparency Act. So
yeah, and it's getting more involved, and this is pretty good thing because think about it this way: I have had. It's been some time now, so I think a special limitation is over. But I had once a buyer paid for one of our rehabs literally with $20 bills. We don't know where he got those $20 bills, but he came in with like $60,000 worth of cash. Title company says, we can't take this money. He says, I'm not taking it to the bank either. So we told him, okay, you have to, I'm not going to take your cash either. I don't know. It's dirty. I don't want it. I don't know what to do with it. So he went. 3 days later, he came back with all these postal money orders. Postal money orders, they go back then, they were going like for $500 or something like this. He had like hundreds of them.
Exactly. I don't know the specifics of this person, but to me, it sounds like he was laundering money. And this is absolutely what drug dealers and human traffickers do. Is real estate is one of the ways that they launder money.
No. He wasn't a drug dealer. He was in restaurant business.
Okay. Yeah, but again, we don't know, but
we don't know, but there is a certain percent, certain businesses in the United States, like restaurants, hot dog stands, let's say, well, there's other businesses like that too, that they receive a lot of cash. Gas stations, okay, they receive a lot of cash. Traditionally, the owners of these these businesses, they might not report their cash sale.
That's what it was. As you were speaking, that's what it came to my mind, is they're trying to dodge the taxes pretty much.
Well, first, they're eating the sales tax they're collecting. Second, they're not paying their income tax.
Right.
So these are the people that, like, as a landlord, I can't live outside of the preview of law because I don't accept cash. Everything have a 1099 to it. They're going to be deposited in the bank, all sort of different things. So every penny I collect, I show, I show on my income tax. So like 90% of the landlords, 99% of the landlords, they paid their fair tax. Then there's
Mhm.
another individuals out there that it doesn't seem like to be that many people, but they're substantial that they don't pay their first share. What they
Right
call
here.
it, fair
Yep.
share.
So
So,
remember I mentioned there's two goals for the act is one, it's harming people because there's criminal activity. But then like Hadi just said, he personally knew somebody. I mean, the government is losing just a lot of tax revenue because the people are trying to dodge these laws.
yeah,
So now,
there's
now with the act, it sounds like they're not going to be able to. I wasn't aware of that. I'll add this to the slide, but it sounds like now when you're closing real estate transactions, you're going to have many more requirements. And this is where it's because of this act.
right. And then it's not $10,000 to get reported to IRS anymore either.
Oh, what
It's,
is it?
it's aggregate now. So it might you can take $9,999 there and say, "Oh, I didn't get reported because I didn't meet the threshold uh, threshold. What do you call it? Threshold limit is no
Mm-hmm.
longer applies. Even if you take $5,000 over 3 weeks, you're going to get reported. It's aggregate.
Interesting.
It's a
Mm-hmm.
it's a combination of everything. For most businesses, it doesn't make any absolutely no difference because their average daily balance and the amount of deposit that they get is between the ballpark. But then
Mm-hmm.
an individual, they used to do small deposits routinely, and they would deposit $100,000 worth of money into the bank a little bit at a time, 5,000 here, 6,000.
Mm-hmm.
Now they get reported. Now they get reported, so Internal Revenue Service have them as a cash transaction.
And it
These
gives raises a red flag with the IRS, and it's going to raise a red flag with this act.
right, certain bank account numbers. So the way it works is that you can buy bitcoins if anybody knows what a bitcoin is. So those, if you wire transfer the money to an account, and that account will put it in your account, and you can buy a bitcoin or something like this. Okay, that part is being reported as a 1099. Now the Bitcoin company, if you withdraw from them, they report you with a 1099.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
they're trying to bring Bitcoins into the financial, what do you call it?
Monitoring that they're doing. Yep.
Monitoring. That's right. So if you sell Bitcoin, if you sell it inside of their software, it doesn't show anywhere. But as soon as you start withdrawing, they will 1099 you.
Mm-hmm.
If you deposit in your Bitcoin account, they will 1099 you.
Excellent. That's really, really good information. And hopefully that gives everybody an answer to these myths, myths that I mentioned, where people are worried that basically the government is going to find out all about you and your business and people are going to be able to access it. And like Hadi just mentioned, and what I wrote here is the government already knows all about you. You're already reporting that information about your business entity. Remember, you had to report that to the state anyway. The IRS knows all about you and your business and how much money you make. And then, like Hadi was just saying, is FinCEN is already monitoring all of the financial transactions. They will, look at items that are flagged in bank accounts, retirement accounts. Now I need to add like real estate transactions. Are cracking down on that. $10,000 either in one or aggregate transactions seems to be like the threshold there. And then as far as people being worried about anybody can log in and see who owns my company, uh, the FinCEN assures everybody that's going to be a private database. It's not going to be accessible to the public. Only certain agencies are going to be able to access it, and it's only going to be for law enforcement activities. So hopefully that calms everybody down about this access, disclosing all my personal information. Government already knows all about you, and it's going to be a private database. So don't really worry about that stuff.
Mary, one
Yep.
last thing though. I Last week in June, I am 65 officially.
Oh my gosh.
Very good. So I applied for Medicare.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to this really nice website, something.gov. It says, "What is your name?" I put my name in. It says, "What is your date of birth?" I said my date of birth, and a screen popped up. Didn't ask me any other question. It just,
Auto-populated a bunch of information about you, right?
yeah, so all he did was just, is this information correct? Is this information correct? And then it just continued. It didn't ask me to provide my social security number or my
Right.
home address or anything. It had everything.
Right? The government already knows you. They know your business. Don't be worried about it. And then here, I think I have one last slide, and then I'm going to show you what information you do need to enter. It's such basic demographic information. Like Hadi was saying, they already know all about it for you. All right. So I think this is the last one is what happens if you just say, nope, that's it. I either am willingly going to ignore this. I'm not going to comply with this, or I made a mistake or whatever. Don't do it, because if you don't submit the report there, either if you're an existing entity, remember, if you already exist before 2024, or you set up a new one this year or in the future, or if you don't update the information, let's say you sell it, you change the name, you change an address, or maybe you made a mistake and you have to correct it, there are severe penalties. You get a civil penalty, $500 a day per entity. That can quickly add up. Not just that, but there are also going to be criminal penalties, a fine of up to $10,000, and they're even going to throw handcuffs on you and throw you in jail, up to 2 years. And then they say that this is just for individuals, you as a person, and then they're going to impose penalties there on your business. I mean, these guys, FinCEN is absolutely serious about going after these white collar criminals, or these criminals, who are running these illegal businesses, money laundering, or, there are individuals, unfortunately, in the US who don't trust the government and say they're not going to comply. It's up to you, but I'm not going to, risk running into all of these. It's better just to go ahead and comply. And the attorneys, again, I listened to a couple of presentations about this, and the attorneys were saying, FinCEN is going to go after you. You're sitting there at your job at work, innocently doing whatever. FinCEN is going to go in there, handcuff you, throw you to the ground, throw you in jail. I mean, it is that severe, this new law. So don't ignore it. Okay, and then Hadi, this is where we were talking about your inactive entities. So remember, I mentioned, if you have an inactive entity, it's one that you're just not really doing any business in. Again, the attorneys, I listened to several presentations about this by attorneys who do this for a living. They know the ins and outs of this Corporate Transparency Act. What they were recommending is, if you have an entity, your business is not if your business is inactive, you don't have to file that report. So it's up to you guys, but they were recommending, if you do have an entity and you're not using it anymore, it's better to go ahead and dissolve it. Remember, that's that technical term that the state says. Why? Because, like I said, next year, FinCEN is going to start actively pursuing this and monitoring this and going after people. So starting next year, they're going to jump into our state, databases and search for EIN numbers. And they're going to say, okay, does this EIN number have the report associated with it? Or they're going to jump into the IRS database and say, okay, I see this business here, but do they have a BOIR, associated with it? They're going to start cross-matching everything. If they find an EIN number or a tax return that doesn't have that report, it's going to flag it. And then you're going to get a phone call or a letter from the FinCEN saying, okay, you got an entity, but I don't see, you file a tax return, but I don't see that report. What's going on? You just don't want to run that risk. You don't want the FinCEN calling you, sending you letters, contacting you in any way. You don't want to just run the risk of having some penalties there. So it's better, if you have a business, it's inactive, you just don't use that entity, go ahead and dissolve it. So Hadi, this is what you were talking about, where you just can't say, okay, that's it, I'm done, I'm not going to, use my entity. No, you have to follow steps with the IRS to dissolve it, and you have to file steps with the state, the Illinois Department of Revenue. Hadi, there's a section on the Illinois Secretary of State's office where I think it was called terminating an entity. You have to go on there and you have to fill out some forms. And then it was way too complicated and long to, list how you do it with the IRS. I would just work with your attorney and, your CPA, and they're going to know how to notify the IRS that you're going to dissolve it. But like I said, the moral of this story is, if you've got an entity, you're not using it, go ahead and dissolve it. talk to your CPA because you got to dissolve it with the state, and you got to dissolve it with the, you have to dissolve it with the IRS, and you have to dissolve it with the state.
This year I dissolved one. So the way this is, when you have to file one last tax return, even everything is zero, and there's a little bit checkbox somewhere in that tax return. It says this is the last tax return. Then you fall off of the IRS and state. Illinois Department of Revenue, they might come back and they might want more money from you. But other than that, you file the last tax return, then you're done.
Okay. And then the other thing you want to do when you dissolve your entity, you got to dissolve it at the federal and the state level. And then the other thing you want to do that this is not required by the Corporate Act, but these experts I was listening to recommended also to check anything that you have tied to your entity, money wise. Because remember, FinCEN does monitor all these financial transactions. And if it starts seeing these businesses, they're having these financial transactions, and again, they don't have that report, it's going to flag this stuff, and you might get in trouble then. So if you're not using your entity, close any of the financial accounts that you have associated with the entity. So if you've got a bank account, if you've got a business credit card, I haven't done this, but I guess some of these payment apps are business apps and they're tied to your EIN number, some of these. And this is all I could think of, but I'm sure there's more. Anything business-wise, financial-wise, you have tied to these entities. If you're not using them, close them, get rid of them, dissolve them, just make them go away. Because again, you don't want FinCEN checking all these databases and then saying, okay, I see this business credit card here, but I don't see a report associated with it. I'm going after this individual. Okay, that is it for the Corporate Transparency Act. I know that was a lot of information, but I think it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. If anybody has any last questions here, let me know, and then we'll move over to the step-by-step instructions for how you have to comply. Any questions? So basically, in summary, the Corporate Transparency Act is the way the federal government is going to find out who the true owners of these companies are, and you have to file that report. And the reason they're doing is they want to go after these criminals who are laundering money, hiding assets.